Mead. It's probably the first alcoholic beverage ever consumed. Honey, water, and any natural occurring yeast is all you need to make a mead. A fermented beverage of honey, water, yeast, and sometimes grains, herbs, and spices. It can range from a low of 4% alcohol by volume through a natural yeast to a brain-numbing 20% alcohol content with today's modern strains of yeast. You can make as little as a gallon or 5 gallons or more at a time. In this video, I'll run you through the basic process of mead creation. To put a little twist on it though, we'll ferment 3 batches, 2 with commercially developed yeast and 1 with yeast we capture from the wild. I'll take you step by step, so let's jump in.
Please consider subscribing to our newsletter by clicking on the link in the description and comment section below. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe and click the like button to help the channel grow. The mead making process. Here's what you'll need. A pot sufficient to boil at least 1 gallon of water or several gallons of water, up to 5 gallons. The size of the pot will depend on the size of the batch and the size of the vessel you will ferment your batch. I'll be referencing both a 5-gallon batch I made and a 1-gallon batch to explain the process through this video. You can scale up or down based upon your capabilities, and once you understand the fundamental quantities and ratios. You'll also need up to a 1-quart jar of honey per gallon of water. The best ratio is 2 to 3 pounds of honey per gallon of water. I will explain this in the first section. You'll also need at least 1 gallon of water, preferably spring water, as this isn't chlorinated and has a higher mineral content that your yeast will love. You'll also need a large 1-gallon jug and maybe even an airlock and stopper. I will link to a really inexpensive package in the comments below. But you can also use a 1-gallon jug of your own like they often sell cider in, so long as you clean it well with hot water. I'll also show you how not to use an airlock if you don't have access to one or you don't want to purchase one. You'll also need a stirrer and a funnel for returning the mixture to the jug after it is cool. The 60-second recipe. Step 1. Fill the 1-gallon jug with water. Remove 1 quart and 1 pint of the water and set it aside. Step 2. Pour the remaining water from the jug into the pot and bring it to boil. Extinguish the heat or flame once a 2-minute boil has occurred. You may want to loosen your honey in a hot water bath to help it pour better. Step 3. Add honey and stir it until dissolved. If you want to add any other additions like herbs, you'll want to do it at this point, but I will talk about that later. Step 4. Turn on your burner again and let simmer for 10 minutes. Step 5. Extinguish the burner and place a lid on the pot. Let the mixture slowly return to room temperature. Do not lift the lid. Step 6. Once it has achieved room temperature, use a funnel and put the honey water mixture into the jug. If you use municipal water with chlorine and other additives, you will need to boil your reserve water, as the yeast will not thrive when it comes into contact with chlorine. If you use spring water, add reserved water. Add a couple of inches, up to 6 inches, of space from the rim, so it isn't truly a whole gallon. Step 7. Give it a gentle swirl, then add yeast. Affix airlock and place it in a cool environment. Now wait for at least 3 weeks. For more, listen on, but that's the most straightforward and fastest version. Here's the rest of what you'll need to know to get it right. Honey to water ratio. Do you buy your honey in jars? A quart canning jar is calibrated in fluid ounces using the unit weight of water, which is 8.33 pounds per gallon. 1 pound of water will fill the jar to 16 ounces. A whole quart jar of water, which is 32 ounces, weighs 2 pounds. Honey is much heavier than water and has a different unit weight. Since it is heavier, 1 pound of honey will fill your quart jar only to 10.67 ounces. Filling it fully will give you 32 fluid ounces, or 3 pounds. Is that too confusing? Let me make this as simple as possible. Honey tends to be sold in bulk as pounds. You want a minimum of 2 to 3 pounds of honey per 1 gallon of water. That's going to be roughly 30 to 32 fluid ounces of honey per gallon of water. It's going to be 10 to 12 pounds of honey for a 5-gallon batch. For my 5-gallon batch, I used 2 5-pound containers of honey and 3/4 quart jar of honey I had left over from my fermented garlic honey recipe. So I used about 12 pounds of honey, 4 quarts, for my 5-gallon batch. Your ratios, they don't have to be exact. Just remember that your mead will be 2 to 3 pounds of honey per gallon of water. The best ratio is a 1-quart jar of honey per gallon of water, which I'll use here. If you exceed that, your yeast may not be able to move as freely or may stall out and not convert the sugars to alcohol. It does not matter if your honey is filtered or unfiltered, but I think unfiltered honey imparts more flavor in the finished product. If you use light honey, most of the honey flavor will ferment out. Even the faint orange blossom or clover honey taste will ferment out almost completely. If you use dense, dark, unfiltered honey like an avocado or buckwheat honey, it may have just a slight honey flavor in the final product. The higher the alcohol content, the drier the final product. So it is a standard practice to back sweeten the mead when drinking it by adding a little honey into the drinking glass. Variations in history. If you add traditional brewing grains like wheat, barley, or oats, you'll create what is called a braggot. It will have a more malty flavor and it is really a fortified beer. You'll have to boil your grains and remove them if you do this, leaving only the wort before adding the honey. If you don't boil your grains first, certain chemicals you need a PhD in chemistry to correctly pronounce won't break down. The result will be something that is too bitter to drink, that will be similar to what you might imagine bitter soy sauce to taste like. Make sure you do boil your grains first and research enzymatic rest so you understand a little something about beer making. A more common variant is called methaglin, which is a spice or medicated variety of mead. This type is well known in Wales but is more common than a regular plain mead. To make this type, you would make a strong tea out of about a quart of water. You can use any of these common additives: orange peel, cinnamon, lavender, lemongrass, basil, dried cherries, coriander, vanilla bean, licorice root, cloves, mulling spices, or any tea of your liking. Always use natural ingredients and remember that a little will go a very long way in your finished product. You want the tea to be strong in character but light in nature in the finished product. Mead made from grape must and honey is called piment and was popular with the ancient Romans. A mead made in combination with apple cider was called cider and was popular with the Nordic people. Melomel is honey combined with any other fruit. As you'll note, there are hundreds of variations that have depended mainly upon what fermentable resources existed in the area where the mead was being made. I would encourage you to start with the basic recipe I presented here and let that serve as your baseline for further experimentation. Honey is only about 18% water, which means that yeast and bacteria can't really grow in it. This is why a common practice has been to treat open wounds with pure honey. This is why it is also shelf-stable indefinitely if it is sealed and kept from exposure to air. However, it will crystallize over time. It's still really good, but you'd have to gently heat it to return it to a liquid state. That is best done by placing the sealed container in warm water. It's also hydrophilic, which means it grabs moisture from the air. If enough air and moisture gets in to increase the water proportion much above 18%, the honey can become hospitable to microorganisms like bacteria or yeast. The first mead was entirely created by accident. At some point, water was mixed with honey in a container. Since honey is hygroscopic, meaning that it pulls moisture from the air, and yeast and bacteria are trapped in honey and can't grow until they have enough water in the mix to move around, this accident may have occurred, well, quite easily. When honey is mixed with water and left out, exposed to air, fermentation will start within a few hours. When the people of that time, probably cavemen or earlier, drank the fermented beverage, they likely felt the effects. Brewing is still done in the same way, and sometimes in open pots still today. So how old is mead? Nobody really knows. The first batch was made by the first people to collect and store honey. It was probably around 6% alcohol, but in some instances might have been higher. Yeast. Yeast, sugar, and water are the components of fermentation. As I mentioned earlier, I prefer to use as local of spring water as I can find. I like to use as local of honey I can find as well. Yeast is what will impart the flavor. You can't get more local than harvest it from your backyard, but it won't ferment with as high of alcohol content as champagne yeast will. Always, always, always leave a few inches of room at the top. The yeasts that ferment this are top fermenting, meaning that they hang out at the top. When they expel their gas, they make a foam. This is much more prominent in something with greater body and texture, like with the addition of grains. However, mead fermentation is so fast and aggressive it can bubble fast. You want that extra room. I've had beer so aggressively ferment that the airlock couldn't keep up. I woke up to beer on my ceiling, which is not fun, I assure you. For this smaller demonstration batch, I inoculated it with 3 yeast strain batches I made earlier. To me, all kitchen and garden creations are an experiment. We only capture best practices in the form of a recipe. For the 3 batches I previously made, I wanted to see what alcohol content would be produced by each before adding them all together. I used yeast I harvested from the wild using potato. You'll want to check out that video on this channel. I also used a yeast specifically cultivated for professional sweet mead, and I used yeast specifically for champagne. The natural yeast should have come out at about 5% from what I had read, so I was pleasantly surprised when I achieved 6.5% alcohol after about 2 weeks. The sweet mead yeast came out to about 9.9% alcohol. The champagne yeast came out to a whopping 10.5% after about 2 weeks. When I swirled the champagne yeast mead, the alcohol content I whiffed off practically burned my nose. I later combined all 3 batches together, and after 2 months, I had an alcohol by volume of around 16%. The depth of flavor from the 3 different yeasts gave it more character, in my opinion. The only way to accurately determine alcohol content is through the use of a hydrometer. This instrument measures a liquid's density compared to water. Before the mead is inoculated with the yeast, it is measured to give what is called the original gravity, or starting gravity. A second measurement after the bubbling stops can be compared to this starting gravity to determine the alcohol by volume and whether fermentation has stopped. At some point, the alcohol content becomes too high for the yeast, and it mostly dies off or goes dormant and falls to the bottom. So I usually pour the contents off to another container and leave those dregs of yeast behind because as they expire, they can impart a bitter taste to the liquid. I highly recommend you try the potato harvested wild yeast for this recipe. This will take 3 days to cultivate, so make it in advance of boiling the water and adding the yeast. You will add the yeast, puree potato, and all only when your batch has achieved room temperature. That is true for any yeast you put in your batch. Your batch has to be at room temperature. If it is too hot, above 100 degrees, the yeast will begin to die off or have a harder time establishing itself. All yeast start truly dying off at about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. You want your yeast to be plentiful, hungry, and robust, so it will establish itself before any other yeast or bacteria can. Once the alcohol content produces high enough, bacteria and other yeasts can't find a home. One final note on yeast. Yeast gives off CO2, alcohol, and polyphenols. Polyphenols are the taste and smell of your final product. You can make the same batch of honey water and inoculate it with 3 different yeasts as I did earlier, and you'll end up with 3 different tasting meads. And to answer the question for you that you may be thinking, you could use bread yeast, but your finished product may taste a little bready. I tried it here adding it late to the batch and got no bread smell or taste off the final product, so you can do it. It does work just fine. If you don't want to buy a yeast-specific yeast for mead making, I suggest a potato harvested wild yeast method. Consult my other video for that. Place your brew pot with polyphenols in mind because the warmer the environment, the more polyphenols created and the harsher they will be. A small batch like this you can place in a cool closet, unused bathtub, or a cool spot in your kitchen. I have made delicious meads in my 80-degree garage, but for your first batches, you want to place them in a room temperature environment to let the fermentation happen and avoid harsh flavors. This is also true when drinking the mead or any fermented beverage, for that matter. If you chill it, the polyphenol effect will be lessened. This can make an okay wine better and more palatable. Technically, mead is just honey wine. When it's done. I'm assuming you don't want to spend $50 on a hydrometer for this mead, and you may not even have a bubbler. I'll link to a 1-gallon jug with an airlock and stopper you can get for around $12. You can use it for everything from cider to mead. I suggest you start with a 1-gallon batch of mead, as I'm detailing here, before graduating to larger batches. This minimizes your losses if you make an error. Good mead can ferment for at least 3 months, though you could drink it anytime after a month. The best mead is bottle aged for a year. 1 year is the optimal time to drink it, in my opinion. But here's the catch though. To bottle mead, which has such a high level of fermentable sugars, you have to know when the fermentation is, for the most part, complete. Otherwise, the CO2 pressure will build up in the bottle and your bottle will explode. This is where the hydrometer is handy. This is also where the bubbler comes in handy. With the bubbler, you can count the bubbles per minute. A slow bubble rate of 1 per minute or so means the yeast is tiring out. When the bubbles are too rapid to count, the yeast is doing its thing and still working away at the sugars. If your bubble rate is too slow to measure, give the container a gentle swirl, and you should see a vigorous head of bubbles that dissipate rapidly. I've also used a bubbler, and I've also used a paper towel, doubled over and lightly sprayed with bleach. You don't want any bleach to come into contact with the mead you're making, but this reduces the possibility of wild yeast getting in your mix. For the yeast, you can either buy a champagne yeast online in dry form that can be sprinkled over the room temperature mixture, or you can buy a liquid packet of yeast that doesn't store as long. Must be refrigerated, but comes pre-mixed. You can also skip the store-bought yeast for traditional natural yeast and use my potato method for harvesting wild yeast. Don't worry, your finished product won't taste like potatoes, and the mead will benefit from the extra starches and nutrients. That will give you a final product of about between 5 and 8% alcohol with plenty of honey flavor. It's a little harder to bottle a wild yeast because there's a little more uncertainty about when it's done or whether it's just taking its time. For our purposes, and assuming you aren't ready to invest in a hydrometer, your fermentation will be mostly done sometime after a month. If you put your gallon container in an ice bath with a little bit of salt in the bath, it is called cold crashing. This will remove some of the haze and further slow yeast activity. Next, pour your clear product into another container and consume it within a few weeks. Make sure to burp the bottle, even if refrigerated, to avoid a buildup of CO2. If you let it sit in the second container for more than 2 months, fermentation will be complete, and you could pour it off to bottles and confidently bottle age it for a few months, even years. For such a small batch though, I would just let it ferment for anywhere between 1 and 3 months. Cold crash it, then pour it off to bottles to be consumed within the month you bottle. Your alcohol content will be somewhere between 6 and 20% depending upon the yeast you use. If you're near to 20%, you will feel and taste it. There's so much more to this several thousand-year-old recipe, but I wanted to provide you with just enough to get a batch started without overwhelming you. So here you have it. Give it a shot, and let me know in the comments below how you did. Please remember to give this video the thumbs up and consider subscribing to this channel for more great practical prepping recipes and skills. Learning the basics of fermentation will be a godsend after a disaster. Whether that's beer or mead, alcohol has a host of purposes in a post-disaster environment. From further distillation to sterilization to rendering a drinkable substance that isn't susceptible to wild pathogens to just a good old stiff drink to tradable commodity. I guarantee the person who knows how to ferment beverages will have a place in most impromptu prepping groups. As always, stay safe out there.